Okay, well, thanks again for having me, and thanks everyone for making it out to the virtual meetup, I guess, during COVID times and all that. It's actually kind of nice that I'm able to like jump into a meetup that's happening in the Flutter Chicago from here in California. Um, so I'm going to talk today about InteractiveViewer, which is a new widget that we just merged into master a few weeks ago, I think. So it's in the master channel. You might not have seen it yet, but I'm going to go through a few examples of what it is and how you can use it and how it came about. So to get started, my name is Justin. I gave a little bit of an introduction while we were hanging around here in the beginning, but I might repeat myself for anyone who was there. But I am an engineer on the framework team at Flutter at Google in Mountain View. The majority of my time at Flutter has been spent working on improving our text editing, which is like a big, huge, broad field. We have a lot going on and a lot that we can still do. But I've dabbled around in some other things on the side, namely doing a demo that ended up becoming InteractiveViewer. And I joined Google and immediately went into the Flutter team at, I think, like fall 2018. And the first thing that I built when I was still just kind of exploring Flutter and getting to know what it was and how it works, and even like whether or not I liked it, it looks like this. So I wanted to build a demo just to kind of like dip my toes into the water with Flutter. I had come from a web background, so I'd done like a lot of JavaScript, no Dart before. Some front end, some back end, but I had gotten deep with Canvas and SVG a few times in the browser, which is how the browser does a lot of custom graphics rendering. So done some like more off the beaten path things than what you would usually do with HTML tags and things like that. And I really wanted to see how Flutter would handle some really custom drawing kind of stuff like that. You know, I had seen a lot of the demos that Flutter has on the website and the introductory materials and things like that. And Flutter could obviously like draw something that looks like a great looking app and feels responsive and things like that using the existing typical UI elements that you might see. But I wanted to try drawing something that was really beyond that and weird. So I went with a hexagon grid. And this this demo here, it's actually, yeah, I never actually built a game out of it. It's kind of just a grid that allows you to change the colors of the hexagon tiles and things like that. But I wanted to see how it would handle, how Flutter would handle something like something that didn't fit the mold exactly as everything else did. So from my web background, thinking about like a hexagon grid, there are a couple of problems that you would run into in the browser with trying to render something like that. The browser does everything based on like a box, like everything's at a right angle kind of model. So just drawing a hexagon might be tough off the bat. Laying the hexagons out in this kind of grid would also be tough. And doing hit detection on those would be really tough because you're going to have, if you consider each hexagon to be a square, then each one will have a corner that overlaps its neighbor, and the hit detection is going to be kind of tough on that. So I wanted to try drawing something like this in Flutter, and it actually worked out pretty nicely. I found that, as some of you might have seen who have worked with Flutter a little bit more, you can do a lot of custom rendering stuff and just kind of wrap it all into the existing like widget framework that Flutter has. You can make a widget that's drawn with any crazy kind of thing that you want, and then just package it up as a widget. And that was really different for me coming from the web, where you can't really take a canvas, draw something crazy, and then package it up into an HTML tag. But that's basically what you can do in Flutter. And so I was pretty impressed at this point. You know, I came at it trying to be skeptical, trying to push the limits, but I had a good time up until this point drawing this hexagon grid. But from here, I wasn't done. You know, I wanted to, in my vision, the next step that I wanted to take was to do something a little bit more interactive. I wanted something where you could kind of like zoom in on a specific area of the action in this hypothetical game that never happened, or pan around the screen and find some corner, or zoom all the way out like this and see everything that's going on at a high level. and have this like really snappy interactive experience like that. And so as you might do as someone who's getting comfortable with Flutter, the first question that I asked myself was, is there a widget for that? There's so many widgets in the Flutter widget catalog, and often they do nearly exactly what you want. So is there something I can just slap my hexagon game board into and just get all of that kind of like scrolly, fun, interactive ability? And at the time, the answer was no, unfortunately. But now the answer is InteractiveViewer, which we're going to get into. But when back then, when I was looking through the widget catalog and seeing, what kind of things could I use to do something like that, I ran into a few widgets that were pretty close, would get me partially there. Transform was one of them. It's kind of a niche layout widget. What it does is it takes a child, so any widget, as you're familiar with, you can pass any widget tree as a child to any other widget in Flutter for the most part. And it also takes a matrix 4, and it applies that matrix, the transform that matrix represents, to the child in like a static way. So you pass it a matrix and it renders your child, but maybe like rotated and put off to the side of the screen or something like that, whatever transformation your matrix represents. So it was getting me close to the way there, but I wanted the interaction, so I started looking at how to get the gestures from the user, and I found the obvious widget gesture detector. A lot of you who've worked with Flutter a little bit in the past, I'm sure you're familiar with gesture detector. It has support for listening to a lot of different gestures that users can do. The things that I wanted, like pinch to zoom and things like that, and panning, flinging even, those are all things that are supported pretty easily with gesture detector. So that was great. It checked all the boxes for me. But what I really wanted was kind of a combination of the two. I needed to put both of them together and create this like ability to pan and zoom and do all that kind of stuff that I had imagined. So that got me on the track of like Flutter's composition model. So as a lot of you probably know, Flutter, a lot of its power is based on its ability to compose widgets together. So rather than having like an object-oriented, like classical inheritance model where you extend, where one widget might extend another, everything is done by composing them together, nesting them within each other inside of their build methods, more or less. And so that allowed me to kind of, following this pattern, I could like jam these two widgets into my demo code and come up with something that basically did what I was looking for. And the result of that was like one of the first things that I finished in Flutter that I could actually show to other people, which was a demo of this game board with the panning and zooming and everything like that. And that ended up being a gallery demo in the official Flutter gallery. And it was kind of like a hacky kind of code base. I didn't really abstract anything or make it very reusable, but it worked. And I was able to combine those two widgets and get the functionality that I wanted. And that thing went into the Flutter gallery. It was probably early 2019 or something like that. I think it's still there. The gallery has been split into its own project. But that ended up being, something that works, even if the code wasn't too pretty, since I had just started doing Flutter. But from there, I actually started getting some requests from other developers, first on the Flutter team themselves, my teammates at Google, who one of them had a table and they wanted to be able to pan around the table in 2 dimensions. And I even had people reaching out to me randomly, like on the pull requests that I had done and on the issues that I had been opening related to this. And all of this input of people who wanted to do similar things got me thinking, should there be a widget for that? I realized that there wasn't at the time, but is this something that we can abstract, pull out of the game board thing and make something that works for all of these different use cases? So the table example that I was talking about looks something like this. I kind of made this after the fact as a demo of what you could do. But I wanted to say, could we take that same code and do a simplified version that just lets you pan around in 2 dimensions from a table of data, just like this? This is what my teammate was asking me about. I had the other people pinging me on GitHub. Someone was asking me about an image viewer like this. So similar to like a Google Photos or an Apple Photos, something that lets you open up a viewer of a single image and kind of like zoom around it, zoom in on a certain location, pan around, that kind of the stuff that you're used to in Apple Photos and Google Photos. And I even had somebody ask, can we just take an ordinary widget and maybe throw it around the screen, maybe rotate it upside down, and keep using it like it's a normal widget? So actually, yeah, nobody asked me for that. But this is it's a Flutter widget. It's all composable. We should totally be able to do that, regardless of whether this has any utility or not. This is something we should totally be able to do. I was totally convinced that yes, this should be a widget, and we should be able to throw anything we want into it and build any one of these things that we see here. So I ended up building that. I built a widget called InteractiveViewer. I came back to it like probably over a year later after I had originally written that demo, and we just got it merged a few weeks ago. And this is basically what the code ended up looking like. So just like any other Flutter composition, we have the widget InteractiveViewer, which wraps any other widget or subtree of widgets as children. And once you've done that, you've wrapped your widget in InteractiveViewer, it just opens everything up and makes it interactive. The user can play around and explore and do what they want, and I wanted it to be that easy to use. But in order to support these 3 examples that we've seen, there were a little bit of like configuration that we had to do, adding a few different parameters and allowing users to do a few different like specific things that were needed to make this really a reusable generic widget. So in the rest of the talk here, I'm going to go over what those configuration parameters are and how you use them and how you can put that all into InteractiveViewer to cover a lot of these kind of different examples and hopefully use InteractiveViewer for your own kind of use cases as well. All right. So one feature that came up pretty early was the ability to limit how far a user can zoom in or out of the child. So it becomes kind of obvious when you think about like the user might zoom in so far that like 1 pixel is covering the entire screen and they can't really pan around. They're kind of like lost. They don't even know what part of the image they're in. So it's useful to be able to stop that and keep them within a range that makes sense for the application that you're presenting to them. It also makes sense to not allow them to zoom out beyond a certain level. In the case of the photo viewer, you don't want them to be able to zoom out beyond just filling the screen with the image in the case of this specific photo viewer. So you want to be able to limit it on both sides. And the, the API that we came up with that was simply just a min scale and max scale parameter, which takes double each and can be basically anything between 0 and infinity or infinitely small and infinity. And this will allow you to prevent the user from zooming in or out beyond what you expect them to do. I have this link to the documentation down below, so I might try to share these slides out later. We have the documentation for all of this stuff contains a lot of these examples as well. So also, if you just search for InteractiveViewer in the official Flutter documentation, you can find all of these parameters and a lot of similar examples to what we're seeing right now. So another kind of setting that people wanted to set was to be able to disable zoom. So in the case of the table, actually, in the majority of the tables, you probably don't want to be able to zoom them. If you think of like Google spreadsheets or things like that, without changing the size of the screen, you can't really just pinch and zoom in. So if users are doing the pinch gesture, they shouldn't actually be able to change the zoom level of your table. So the way we did that was just another Boolean, really simple addition of a little bit of config to make this more useful. And we also added a pan enabled. So if you wanted to prevent the user from panning and only allow them to zoom, or both temporarily, you could do that as well. one thing that came up with the table was to be able to have a widget that's bigger than the screen itself. So you might have noticed while working with Flutter, we have a constraint system. So the parent passes down some size constraints to its children. And so usually, also if you think of something like if I go back, the image viewer that we saw before, you can see that the image is sizing itself to the size of the screen. So it's constrained by the size of the screen, and it knows that, and it's able to position it within itself. But then we have the other application of the table, where it, regardless of the size of the screen, it wants to be able to draw even beyond that and allow the user to pan those kind of things into view. So we had to make sure that we supported both use cases. If the user wanted something that fits itself to the screen, or even fits itself to a smaller viewport of an interactive viewer, somewhere on only a portion of the screen, we wanted to be able to, for users to be able to size things just as if the interactive viewer wasn't there, and just to use the existing constraint system that Flutter has. But we also wanted to support things like the table. And a simple parameter called constrained is what we ended up doing there. So by default, the constraint is true, and your child will behave exactly as if the interactive viewer wasn't there. But if you want something that's really big, like the game board or like the table, it's a good idea to set constraint to false. And if you get some weird sizing problems or layout problems, you might want to try playing around with that parameter. Another fun one is invisible wall, like a boundary. Similar to the min scale and max scale, sometimes you don't want the user to be able to pan really far away from the child itself, or from the center of the child, or some focal point that you're working with on the child. And so a fun approach that we came up with for that is a boundary, which is kind of like a box around the child, and the viewport should never be able to view anything outside of that box, is the general idea. And so we define that as boundary margin. So this is, it takes an edge insets, which you might recognize from the padding widget as well. So anytime you're specifying padding in Flutter, you're usually using an edge insets, which just specifies a double for the 4 sides of a box. And that's just what it's doing here. So when I set my boundary margin to 100 on all 4 sides, I'm just giving it a little bit of extra 100 padding beyond the edge of the child at all 4 sides. So the default for boundary margin is actually 0, which would be a boundary that is just tightly wrapped to the child. So if you don't pass anything, you'll have a behavior similar to the image viewer that we saw before, where you can't pan beyond the image itself. And here, if I had passed none, you wouldn't be able to pan beyond the square or rectangular edge of the game board itself. But this 100 gives us an extra 100 of space. If you don't want any boundary at all, you can pass edgeinsets.all and pass a double.infinity for that. So that'll give you like an infinitely large margin, and so you won't have any boundary at all. And then you can, in fact, like pan miles and miles beyond the edge of your child if that's what you want to be able to do. Yeah, the only other thing to note about this is that you can see in the GIF here, when I sort of like fling it towards the wall, and it actually hits the wall and then slides up. So there's a little bit of like physics involved in that, and it will kind of like hit the wall and slide as if there's like a low friction surface on the wall. And that behavior is pretty similar to like other sort of like image viewers and things that you might see. So we've seen a lot of like kind of passive features here, but when you want to actually do we have more control over what's going on, we introduced a controller for that. So in the case of this GIF, if you want to be able to listen to the actual value of the matrix itself that InteractiveViewer is using, and then maybe change some things based on that. So in this case, we are listening to the zoom level of the matrix and updating, like, say, the detail of the hexagons based on that. So we're showing some more detailed colors when the user gets a certain zoom level. So the way that we do that is by using a controller similar to what you may have seen if you're familiar with text editing controller in TextField and a few other controllers around the Flutter framework. We pass this controller object to transformation controller, which then gives us the ability to listen to the change in the matrix values. So I want to look a little bit closer at that code. So this is how you declare a transformation controller. It is its own new class, and it has a value, which in our case is matrix 4, which, as we saw before, it's the same thing that the transform widget takes. It's how we define the transformation of our of the child. So at a high level, often transformations like panning, zooming, rotating, skewing, things like that are handled by, or are rather represented by a matrix, rather than maintaining a value like the scale as a double or the translation, the panning as an offset. You have a matrix, which is basically all of that stuff combined into, in this case, a 4x4 matrix of values. And the reason why you do this is because it makes it really easy to combine these values. There's no ambiguity between what order these operations happen in or anything like that. And you can take this matrix and send it to the hardware and have it applied to every pixel and find the final location of each pixel. And computer hardware is very efficient with doing these kind of matrix operations at the low hardware level. So that's why we use this matrix for InteractiveViewer. And from the what this means here, matrix 4.identity is just the identity matrix, which is basically like a multiply by 1 kind of thing. So it's just the home state of your transformation. So that would be like where the user first starts out if you change nothing, and you just are starting out looking at the child as it would be without any transformation. And that's the default. So that's how you might declare your transformation controller. But then because transformation controller, it's actually a subclass of value notifier. So you can add listeners to that. You'll get informed whenever that matrix changes. Usually that's changing because the user is panning, dragging, zooming, things like that. You'll get notified of all of that. And then you can perform operations based on that. So where my ... ellipsis is here, you could call set state and say show hexagon details or something like that, which is basically how I did the example that you saw on the previous page. So on matrix 4, you can see transformation controller.value in my if here towards the bottom. That is the matrix 4, and there are a bunch of useful methods on that already exist in Dart's vector math package, which is where matrix 4 comes from. So you can get the scale just using this existing method. It's pretty convenient. It has a scary name, get max scale on axis, but it'll just give you the single double the double type number that represents the scale, because InteractiveViewer isn't scaling things in like a stretched out kind of way. So it just has one value, and you can compare that directly. That's how zoomed in or zoomed out you are. And you can do the same thing for checking where translation has happened and how the user has panned around the screen, things like that. You get all this kind of passive information. But if you want to do something active, let's say you want to actually change programmatically what the transformation is, you can also do that through transformation controller. So you can actually update transformation controller.value at any time by assigning it to a new matrix. And that will immediately update the view that you're seeing in your app and translate immediately to whatever new position the new matrix represents. So as an example, here you can actually do an animation with that. So as you saw there, the user, it's restarting. So as the user zooms into the corner, there are often some weird corner. They press the reset button, and it takes them with a nice animation back to the home position represented by the identity matrix. So we're just animating between whatever matrix the user happens to be at, whatever transformation, back to the original one. And we can do that with transformation controller. So I want to show you how to actually do that and go into a little bit of detail. So Flutter's animation library it has a really great feature of being agnostic to whatever type you're using for the most part. So you've probably seen a lot of animations that do things like fading in and out. They probably operate on a double. So you might have an animation that animates from 0 to 1, going from 0 opacity to 1 opacity, for example. And the animation just gives you all the intermediate values on some curve. But that's if you're using a double. You can also use a lot of other things, like an offset or even a matrix 4 itself. So I can create a new animation here with the begin value as whatever transformation the user is currently at. So I'm starting where they're at and ending on, in this case, the identity matrix. So ending at the home position. And what this does is it gives you, rather than a double from 0 to 1, it gives you a matrix tweened between these two different matrix values. And if you apply that to the transformation controller's value, it gives you this nice animation from one translation to another. And it just kind of worked out really nicely. I didn't know what I was getting into when I decided to add this feature, and it ended up being so easy. It was one of the things that really impressed me when I was early on hacking this into my hexagon grid demo, because the animation library was so easy to use since I could just use matrix fours. So with this code, I mean, you're listening to the animation as you normally would, and anytime that value changes, we're going to apply that to our controller, and it will immediately update what the user is seeing, and it produces that nice, smooth animation. So just like any other animation as well, you could also change the curve for this. You don't have to use a linear curve. You could use any sort of bouncy curve that you wanted, and it just, everything works together with Flutter's existing animation library. It's really nice. And yeah, so there we have the GIF again you've already seen, but that's how it works. All right, so I want to quickly recap the different parameters and everything that we went over. But at a high level, I mean, you can take any widget tree that you want, anything that exists in Flutter in the widget catalog, and stick it into an interactive viewer and just make it like kind of come alive with interaction and let the user be able to play around with it. That goal that I initially had is still there, even with these different configurations that you can have. But if you want to get more detail as to what's going on, we looked at all these different parameters that allow you to do that kind of stuff: constrained, minimax scale, scale enabled, and boundary margin. And then we looked at the transformation controller. So whenever you want to do something active with programmatically setting what the user is seeing as they transform your scene, transformation controller is what you want to look at. So I have another link to the documentation, but again, if you just Google the interactive viewer docs in the main Flutter docs, you'll find all of this. There's a good overview of all these. And a lot of these that are a little bit more complicated have the examples that we saw before live in the docs. So tried to make that pretty straightforward and to kind of see like what people can build with this kind of stuff. So from here, there are a lot of issues that we're still working on providing new functionality for Interactive Viewer out on GitHub right now. So I'd encourage you to check this out and play around with it if you have any use cases for it or ideas for what you might want to do. If you think of something that's even stretching beyond what you've seen here or what you think it might be able to do, if you don't see an issue for it, feel free to open a new one. I'm totally interested in making this as like general and useful as possible. We have a lot of like interesting things that we still want to add to this that are open GitHub issues right now. And beyond that, if anybody's really interested in pursuing any one of them, PRs are always welcome. Flutter is a totally open source project, and we're always looking for contributions from people outside of our core team. So feel free, whether you're opening up an issue or a PR, feel free to tag me. I'm happy to help triage that and get it moving and provide code review and everything for pull requests. So thank you guys so much for listening to the talk. I'm happy to go over questions or anything like that, or even talking about any more broad questions about Flutter. So thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Justin. I think that a few of us are going to have questions. I have one to get us started. So when you were talking about invisible wall, I wonder, can you have just invisible, like, would there be a way to just like make it, I'm thinking of a scrolling, like ever scrolling horizontal screen. So making it so that it can't go up or down, but it can go to the sides. Could you do that with invisible wall?
So actually, when I was building this, I explicitly tried to make support for that very thing. I thought maybe somebody wants to have an infinitely wide child, but have some tight height constraint. And actually, I ran into problems with the matrix math functions that are built in that Flutter uses, and some of them wouldn't take infinite values. So I kicked that onto the back burner. So unfortunately, you're not able to pass in partially infinite boundary margins. But for the case of what you want to do, you could probably get around that just by making the horizontal boundaries very, very wide. So if you just added a value beyond what you might expect someone to actually spend time scrolling to, you probably get the same effect there. So that's what I'd recommend you to do for now.
Cool. Yeah, actually, the Moleskin app, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but I am pretty sure they're native, but because they do have an iOS and an Android one. I think it's by the Moleskin brand. I don't know if it's just called Moleskin, but it's their like flagship notebook taker, and that's how that one works. And it's actually it's pretty cool. It's constrained in this axis, but then it scrolls forever. But it kind of works. It can't. I believe it can work like pages, even though it can keep scrolling forever as well. So I think that's pretty cool. And I guess that we could do something like, I mean, if you kind of wanted to work like pages, but like that's easy because you could just make it a certain width that the user feels like they're scrolling for a really long time, but you're just like, oh, width 10 times the width of the phone or something like that, and then it feels like it's super, super long, and it is, but you know, that's how we could go around it. But yeah, I think like when I saw that app, it's really expensive, but I thought that it was really, really cool. And it like immediately, when you were talking about invisible wall, that's like what immediately came to my mind. But I think that is so cool because that is something that comes up, just like invisible wall is so cool because it's something that definitely comes up when handling zooming and all this sort of life with views. So I think it's a really cool feature. I really like that. So I'm gonna open it up to more questions, but something that I wanted to ask you is that, is there, so like before anybody drops, could we possibly get your Twitter or like any more questions or anything if you have it available, like open for people? And also, could we have the slides? And are they available online anywhere? Cool.
Sure. So yeah, there's my Twitter in my
Nice.
slides if everyone can see that. Yeah, so feel free to reach out to me on there. And for sharing the slides, yes, after this talk, I'll share them directly with you. I'm limited. I created them on my Google email account, so I'm unable to share it beyond, like, I'm unable to make it totally public.
Okay.
But yeah, we can create a duplicate version or something like that.
Nice. Okay, cool. I just wanted to make sure to like that everybody can see that info on like how to contact you on Twitter and your GitHub, so we can follow you and stuff. Cool. So now opening it up to more questions.
Cool.
Yeah, this is Stephen Kleba. I just wondering, could you use it as a replacement for overlay right now? Doing like a floating action button. So I have like an avatar, and I want to put the edit button over, overlay it, and without using overlay, could I use this?
Would it be something that would be like panned or zoomed, or would it be something like static that's stuck in one position?
No, I'd use your things to make it static, but yeah.
Okay, so if positioning is the key there, like Z positioning, I wouldn't use interactive viewer. I'm sure like there's a lot you can do with hacking things like that, but I would stick to something like overlay or stack itself. Yeah, but yeah, it depends on specifically like what you want to do. But in general, if it's like interactive viewer, the benefit of it is a lot of like dynamic and motion interactivity.
Yeah, it's like I looked at overlay, I was going to do it, but I just just saw yours, and it's like you can transform anything and put it in place, and I'm like, ooh, that'd be awesome if I could just take it and do that. But
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, so if you do want just a static transformation, you can use the transform widget, which is what Interactive Viewer uses under the hood. But even simpler than that, the stack widget is probably what you want exactly, because stack is similar, but it uses just the like Cartesian. You just set like an offset, an x and a y offset, which is probably the most simple. You don't have to mess with matrices at all. That's the most simple version of what you want, probably.
all right, thanks.
No problem.
Hey, thanks, Justin, for giving this. Sorry, the muting. And what's so great is that there was this issue that was open for over 2 years with if you looked at every single Flutter gallery app, right? What happens with the image is that you can't zoom and also pan it at the same time because those two gestures were mutually exclusive. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how the gesture detection and the gesture arena implementation works with Interactive Viewer.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you're talking about the image viewer where I took that picture that we see in my demos from the Flutter gallery. Is that right?
So there's a few issues on GitHub, and I was laughing because I pulled one up, and it was you closed it actually, right? So you had the last comment because it says it's fixed in the Interactive Viewer. So I was wondering what is some of like that fix that you made. Is it like, can we take it outside of the Interactive Viewer and use it elsewhere with just a general gesture detector, or like a bit more about, I guess, the nitty-gritties maybe about that specific implementation?
Sure. So definitely, if you want to take a look at that source code, this was actually a tricky part of getting it right for Interactive Viewer, and I'll talk about a high-level overview of how we ended up implementing it. But to look at the source code, just for anyone who's not familiar with like digging through the Flutter open source project on GitHub, if you open up the Flutter main page on GitHub for the Flutter framework and press T, it'll give you a search in the code, and then you can type Interactive Viewer, and the first result should be the big chunk of source code for everything that we've seen today. And so in there, you can find exactly how I'm using gesture detector in order to do all this stuff. So, the method that you want to look for is on scale start, I believe. And it's interesting that that is scale, because gesture detector has a lot of different, as I mentioned, it has a lot of different specific callbacks that allow you to listen to different gestures. But in Interactive Viewer, actually, just about all we use is scale. And the reason is that scale gives you the two finger points of movement, and we use that to do both panning and scaling. And if you really start playing around with Interactive Viewer, you can notice how you can kind of even use two fingers to change the focal point of a scale in order to kind of like two-finger pan as well. So in order to get all of that stuff kind of working cohesively in a way that feels like people are used to in something like Google Maps, for example, we just used scale in gesture detector. And you can look through the source code to find like the real nitty gritty of how that works. But it is just keeping track of the previous location that a scale happened, and then the current location at every like tick that were called for these, and comparing the two. And the real trick that is in there for getting it to feel like Google Maps is that what matters is the focal point. So it's the location in between your two fingers. And the key is making what's underneath that when you first touch it, something that's in the example of the game board, say the hexagon that's directly underneath the center point of your two fingers. And as you move them, stretch them, move them around the screen, that point should always be at the same place as the focal point of your fingers. So that's the key, and that's kind of how you'll see, if you dig into the code, you can see how we track that.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, I pulled up the code, but that's a really great high-level overview. And thank you so much.
Yeah,
That's
no
very
problem. It's a good question.
I have a kind of random question for someone that's kind of new, I guess, and probably uninformed. But like one thing I took away is obviously the interactive view looks, as you just mentioned, Google Maps a lot like what Google Maps is, right? In some ways, that's an interactive view with the controllers and all kind of similarities. I was wondering if that there's some kind of the work you do kind of work with that team to kind of use some of the things they do and maybe use some of the things you do with the interactive viewer.
I really should have. So when I was building this, a lot of times I would jump in. It's fortunate that like a lot of the source code of Android itself, not Google Maps, but Android itself is open source. And so when developing in Flutter, I'll often actually look at the source code of Android and kind of crib things that way. And fortunately, being at Google, we can also reach out to often the people who work on that stuff. But a lot of what I was mostly doing when I was matching the behavior of Google Maps and everything was just, you know, using the two apps side by side and making sure that they worked out the same. So Google, Flutter has an implementation of Google Maps, but it's based on a native view. So it's not implemented in Flutter itself yet. So this was something we did have to like totally implement anew in Flutter right now. But yeah, there's nothing that's directly ported over code by code.
Hey, since we're mentioning Google Maps and you mentioned like, oh, not yet for an implementation for Flutter, is it coming down the pipeline? Because I remember last year we were talking about this in Flutter Interact, and as I understand it, there wasn't really a plan then to sort of make it natively because of the to make it work for Google Maps directly with Flutter. So is it something, because I know that there's a package or a widget to be able to do maps and navigation, but is there something coming down the pipeline for Google Maps specifically?
Well, now that I've done all the hard work with Interactive Viewer, it should be easy, right? Unfortunately, yeah, I've seen those issues. I know what you're talking about. People are asking for a native implementation or a Flutter implementation of Google Maps. And as to my knowledge, no, I don't think there's anyone who's actively working on it. Unfortunately, it is something that would be really nice. I've used the Google Maps plugin myself. There are also a few for like OpenStreetMaps and things like that. And it works for like the basic things. If you get some really like niche things, like behaviors that you want to do, it might start to get tough, but yeah, it is something that I would like to see, especially having worked on Interactive Viewer. But I don't know if anybody, I don't know if it would take, if that's something the community could come and put in a bunch of work for. But yeah, unfortunately, no one on the team currently, like this quarter, has that plan to take a look at. But hopefully, it'll come soon.
Yeah, the thing about the community doing that, to be honest, is that we do need to keep expanding into people that do specifically navigation and map stuff, because that's the whole thing. It would be like rebuilding, not really making like another Flutter package because we have that. It would be more like rebuilding like Google Maps to fit like exactly into Flutter. So we should make friends with the Google Maps team and join forces.
Yeah, agreed. And I joke that like I did all the hard work with Interactive Viewer, but yeah, there's a ton of crazy stuff in Google Maps, obviously, and it's even just to do with like chunking the maps into the portions that the user's likely to view next as they're interacting with the map and being able to download that at the right time and stuff like that. There's a lot to do there.
Yeah. So any more questions about Interactive Viewer?
I have quite a few, but if anyone else has any questions. Well, so composited transforms, when you position an overlay, so right now, let's say you transform an object, right? You have to pass that to the composited transform, which passes it to the overlay. Is that currently working with InteractiveViewer?
That's a good question. So probably not. I haven't specifically tried it or like built anything with it. But so you're talking about inside of in the child of InteractiveViewer having an overlay which is itself transformed, right?
Maybe not necessarily within InteractiveViewer. So let's say, your example of that text box that you rotated, right? So let's say it was a drop down and you have the drop down as an overlay. So if you pass, you would be able to pass like the transformations, right, to get it to overlay properly.
Yes, I wonder if, so if the overlay itself is a child of InteractiveViewer, I would hope that it would mostly work out of the box. But some of those widgets that use overlay are using like overlay.ofContext, which gets the root level overlay of the app. And in that case, that would not be transformed by InteractiveViewer. So it would always just stay in one position. So yeah, it might appear, if that's what's happening, you might have like the anchor of the drop down is moving and the drop down menu is hanging out where it normally would be.
Well, I will play around with it.
Yeah. Let me know how it goes, and feel free to open an issue on that. It might be. It seems like something that there should be a way to get it to work if we like add an overlay at the root of InteractiveViewer or something like that. Should be solvable.
Yeah, that'd be. Well, I'll open an issue if there's something up. Thanks.
Thanks.
Cool. So does anybody else have any other questions? I wonder.
So kind of related to that question that Ray had, repaint boundary, if you wanted to take like a screenshot of your whatever is scaled to, is that possible?
So you want to take a screenshot of like the contents of the InteractiveViewer?
Yeah, whatever it's showing, like do a boundary on it, and then.
Well, yeah, the repaint boundary should definitely work with InteractiveViewer, and it should like properly block things from being viewed outside of the like viewport of the InteractiveViewer. It's something that's used for transform as well outside of the context of InteractiveViewer. Repaint boundary can block, can like prevent transform from painting outside of it. So yeah, you can totally do that with repaint boundary.
Cool.
Okay, one last question. So I've looked into this a bit, but it's been somewhat difficult involving like render boxes. So one issue with whenever you transform something is that, let's say you have a list, right? A list of, just say text widgets, and you transform one of those text widgets in the list to say, 4 times its original size. What happens though is that it just gets transformed 4 times its original size, but it doesn't pass its layout, its new transform layout back into, I guess, the layout sequence. So is there a way to hook into, because I know there's like 2 layout calls. It goes down once and then it goes up once. Is there a way to hook into that layout call to make the parent resize to fit a transformed widget?
Okay, well, the answer is definitely yes, in one way or another. So in the context of InteractiveViewer, the behavior that you mentioned where, like, I imagine you have 4 texts and you make one of them bigger and it's overlapping the other ones. The same thing would happen with InteractiveViewer. It's not going to relay out the things as you move the child around and things like that. But if you wanted to do it, a lot of these internals of Flutter are really well exposed if you want to dig into them. But they're very deep and kind of complicated and less well documented than the rest of Flutter. But so there's kind of like the custom painting stack of widgets, like Custom Painter and that kind of stuff. And then there's like the custom layout side of things, like RenderBox and related widgets like that, or not even widgets. This is part of the like render stack. So if you look at those, there are definitely ways you can do it. In the custom painting side, you can always set like the size of your widget that you're painting. So if you wanted to do the math yourself and say create a widget that just accepts a scale and then it's being drawn by some custom painter, and you can do the math for drawing it bigger, and then you can do the math also on its own size, then by setting that size, it should be able to work within Flutter's existing understanding of layout and constraints and all of that. So that would be one way to do it.
That's really cool. Thanks, Justin. Off the top of your head, so a parallel here is the custom multi-child layout widget, and that provides some more. It's still a bit low level, but less low level compared to the transform. So like with that, you can actually, it makes sense to me, you know, laying out its children. Is there like a comparable, I guess, on the transform side to, I guess, that I can, you know, sink my teeth into and, you know, start maybe, you know, approaching it like with a bit easier than getting down very deep into the nitty-gritty?
I'm trying to connect like my understanding of, I've used like custom single child and multi-child layout widget or layout delegate and all those. But I'm not sure how it connects to like how transform is actually rendering all of it. It's definitely not changing any layout like that. But when you look at inside of these custom layout classes, there's a layout method which allows you to specify using like any code that you can come up with. You can tell the children where to paint and how big their constraints are and things like that. So I think what you would be missing at that level is like the math to do, say you have a transformation matrix, but you want to apply it to the children. You kind of be like missing the math there. But if you could like use Flutter's or Dart's vector math libraries and just do that to transform the offset of each child based on the matrix, then those children which have been repositioned inside of this layout widget would then be part of Flutter's normal layout stack, and things should like flow around it and things like that.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Justin. And thanks for, you know, taking all my questions. I just want to say thank you again for, you know, working on the text editing. I remember that, and that's, you know, doing God's work. Thank you.
Oh yeah, there's always something to work on with text editing.
Hey, Ray and Justin, while we're on this topic, because you mentioned, Ray, like, is there a way, you know, so first, Justin, you said, like, maybe this part is not as well documented as everything else, and I agree with you, because with Flutter, because primarily I'm an iOS developer by day, but and man, I can't even begin to tell you how much I appreciate the amazing documentation that Flutter has. And not only that's the thing about like the system of having well, you and Nilay and like the Flutter team, that is so, not only you guys work so hard in making the documentation amazing, and there's a Flutter channel, and we have so many ways of contacting you, and like you're right here showing us like, here's how you can contact me on GitHub and Twitter. And not only that, but also you guys are like available for questions and stuff. And the fact that everything's like open source. So that is like incredibly helpful. Speaking of, this part might not be so well documented, I have something I can help you with. So speaking of this side of the world and how things are rendered, how you can like basically mark your children as like to be re-rendered and all that sort of stuff, was actually covered by a couple of YouTube videos that I can point you towards. So
Nice.
yeah, so I can actually give you which ones they are so that you can go check them out. And I think that they are like a great way to sink your teeth into this part, which again, is not documented so much that you can go read it, but we have these videos. So the first one, and I think that you should start with this one, is so Andrew Brogdon from the Flutter team, he did like a tour around the US of A last year, and he had a talk, and he did it here at the Flutter meetup in Chicago, but then it was filmed by a different team. It was the GDG Columbus YouTube. So they have in their YouTube channel, you can find it as Get Comfortable with Flutter with Andrew Brogdon. And the channel is GDG Columbus. And you can find there Andrew's entire talk about this. And so here I have my notes on it on my iPad that you can't really see very well. But it's a fantastic talk that basically we go under the hood of Flutter and how exactly like widget, element, and render object all come in together to do exactly this. Like how your children get re-rendered and what exactly happens. So that is a fantastic one. And then he will probably mention it in that talk, but in case he doesn't, he mentioned when he was in the Chicago meetup, two videos on YouTube. One is called Mahogany Staircase.
Oh yeah, that one. That one's good.
Yeah, and then the other one is called Flutter's Rendering Pipeline. That you can also find on YouTube. So those three for anybody who's interested in seeing, but yeah, for anybody who's interested in seeing like Flutter under the hood, how stuff gets rendered, and really if you want to, just in my experience, whenever you want to take out PRs and stuff, it's super helpful to look at that. And I just think it's super interesting. But
Thank you for that recommendation, Valeria. That's great. I haven't seen the one with Andrew Brogdon.
Yeah, so it's Brogdon.
Sorry.
Yeah, and on Twitter, and he's also fantastic, super like available for questions and stuff. Not to put him on the spot, but on Twitter he's Red Brogdon, if you want to follow him, and he's also on the YouTube channel, so you'll see him there too. But yeah, so guys, it is again Get Comfortable with Flutter with Andrew Brogdon, like the main one, and that one's like the one he did at the meetups, and then Mahogany Staircase and Flutter's Rendering Pipeline, if you're interested in seeing that. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure to like put that out there because I do think they're wonderful videos if you're interested in that side and how stuff gets rendered and things.
And what's great about, having these meetings on Zoom is, it's right on the computer. I can just look it up.
Exactly.
Very convenient. Thank you.
Very convenient. Yeah, absolutely. I will also share them later on Twitter because like all three together, so they're packaged. Cool. And I'm sorry, did somebody else, I might have, heard somebody say something before. Did somebody else have a question or wanted to say something about the talk or anything?
What was your Twitter handle?
Justin's or mine?
Yours.
Mine is, let me see if my name is anywhere. So Valeria, like my name, if you can see it there, it's VALERIA. NA Git. So Valeriana Git.
Hey, one more question. Is there any built-in like indicator bar for positioning within the interactive view widget?
How do you mean by an indicator bar? I want to say probably there's nothing, but what do you mean by that?
Like something to show you within the widget, like how far you are scrolled over in either direction, like a sort of transparent bar that appears.
I see. No, there's nothing built in, but if you wanted to add something like that, I would use the transformation controller that I talked about in the talk. If you add a listener to that, you could see, for example, like how far from left to right has the user scrolled, and then you could have a widget outside of Interactive Viewer like floating on the screen that has a percentage or something like that of how far you've scrolled, for example.
Awesome, thank you.
No problem.
And I just added my Twitter handle to, well, I guess it just sent out privately. I'm sorry. I'll send that again to everyone. So does anybody else have any questions? Going once, going twice.
Hey, Justin, since you're working on the text editing, there's Zephyr, right? Is someone, so that's currently recommended by Flutter for an interactive rich text editor. Is that still the case?
I believe so, yeah. We have, unfortunately, yeah, we're unable to do rich text editing right now. It's like, I'm the one who's usually advocating for us getting around to it, but it's an enormous project. It's definitely on a list somewhere, but I'm not sure when we'll be able to get to it. It's going to be important, though, if we want to be able to do things like Google Docs in Flutter, stuff like that. So it's really, I think it's a really vital thing for us.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I think maybe we're good with the Q&A section. Thank you again so much, Justin, for joining us. I absolutely loved that you shared your widget, and it was so exciting that you're the one who built it so that we could ask all our questions. Thank you again so much, and thank you everybody for joining us. It really helps out so much to like still meet through Zoom and sort of have like our meetup community still together. And I love that we're able to have so many of us that are not necessarily from Chicago, but that we can still share. So from that, I have recorded this video. I will get in contact with, I believe we have a YouTube channel. I will tweet it. If you go to the comment section, I did share what my Twitter handle is. And if not, still the Flutter, Chicago Flutter Meetup does have a Twitter, and I'll make sure that we get it out there whenever we can get this video up. I've never used recording on Zoom, so we'll see how it went, but I hope that we can get this information out there for everybody to be able to see it later. Yeah, so thank you again so much, Justin, Nilay, and everybody that joined. Yeah, and have a wonderful night. Bye, guys.
Thanks for having me. It was great. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you.